Hey there, my name is Rafael Seid, also known as Rafa Kalapa, and today I'm going to show you the slides from a custom presentation I did for a client, and this presentation is titled Creating a Powerful Team and Office Environment, Communication, Collaboration, Teamwork, Leadership, and Culture. This presentation took place over the course of a year. It was about 22 sessions, and we're going to just show you some of the main points from this custom presentation, in which I will cover the Pyramid of Enlightened Results, KLT factor, the Johari window, some basic principles from Marshall Rosenberg's process Nonviolent Communication, including the 4 options for how to interpret any message, the tube of communication, the principle of connection before solution, and we'll also be covering the 4 quadrants of leadership and power drawn from Ken Wilber's integral framework. So let's look at the Pyramid of Enlightened Results. At the end of the day, personally or professionally, we all want some result or another. In order to get that result, we need to take action. I've tried getting results, sitting on the couch, wishing really, really hard, and that never got me the results I wanted. So we have to take action in order to get some result or another. In order to know where to take action, it's going to be really useful to know which opportunities are ready and viable now. Opportunities are like a doorway. We take action, walk through the doorway, on the other side is some result or another. In order to determine which opportunities are ready and viable now, it's going to be useful to explore the whole field of possibilities. Now, it's the base of the pyramid that really blew my mind. And the base of the pyramid is the relationships. If the relationships are bad, we are not going to explore the field of possibilities. We're just not going to have the conversations that allow possibilities to rise to the surface. If the relationships are good, then there's every chance that we'll have the conversations to explore possibilities. And that opens up the rest of the pyramid. Out of those possibilities, we'll see which opportunities are viable, we'll take action, and we'll get some results. In order to have these positive relationships, it's going to be a huge plus to be yourself. Authenticity is a plus. However, if being yourself means that you're a jerk or you have all these limitations, then it's going to be useful to work on yourself. Work on your personal and professional development, and you will show up in the way that is more likely to cultivate those positive relationships. So this is the Pyramid of Enlightened Results. And a lot of the rest of this presentation, not all of it, but a lot of it is going to hone in on this base of the pyramid of the relationships. So let's look next at KLT factor. KLT factor stands for know, like, and trust. Now, it turns out that people love working with other people who they know, like, and trust. And people love doing business with people they know, like, and trust. A lot of times in my leadership coaching or in the trainings that I do for clients, we cover a lot of key differentiations, and one of them is that the old paradigm of leadership includes leaders who want to be feared because they're confusing being feared with being respected. And so fear does not equal respect. In fact, fear kills KLT. Throwing your weight around, bossing people around, bullying people, that will nullify the possibility of creating know, like, and trust factor. Now, there are things you can do individually to increase KLT in your relationships, and we'll talk about some of that in this presentation. And there are things that your team can do to increase KLT in all internal and external relationships. So within a team, within a larger organization, and also with whether it's clients or in some cases project managers or other external consultants or contractors with whom your team interacts. Again, Your positive qualities are an asset. And so as you work on increasing those and growing those, you become more genuinely likable and trustable or trustworthy. So let's look at the Johari window. Now, the Johari window is something that was created in the 1950s, and it's used a lot in personal and professional development and also in organizational development. There's a lot to it. I'm just going to cover some very, very basic points about it. There are things in any workplace and in any group of people that are known to the self. Things I know about me, things that you know about you. And there are things that I might not be aware of about myself, or things you might not be aware of about yourself. Now, there are things that are known to others, and there are things that are not known to others. And so where these things intersect, for example, things that are not known to you and also not known to the other people around you, this is an area of unknown activity, and there's not a whole lot that we can do with this because it's out of everybody's awareness, so we can't really work with it. Now, there are things that others might know that you might not know. For example, before going into a client meeting, you have salad in your teeth, and your colleague knows that you do, but you're not aware of it. Or I'm walking around the office with my fly down, my zipper. It's not something that I want to happen. So others might know this, but I might not be aware of it myself. And we all have blind spots, sort of like the mirrors of your car have blind spots. Well, human beings have blind spots too. And so it can be very helpful to have an organizational culture where we welcome other people showing us our blind spots. It's a gift if we want to up-level and improve. And there are areas that are known to the self but are not known to other people. So this is something I might be avoiding or hiding and keeping from others. For example, I was once hired by the owner of a company, and when we got to the bottom line of why he wanted this specific communication skills training and organizational culture training, he said that he wanted to create a safe environment where people felt comfortable disclosing when they made a mistake. This particular company handled very, very high-end heavy equipment, and it turned out that one of the employees had damaged a very expensive piece of equipment, but then didn't tell anybody. He hid this fact because he was afraid of losing his job. And so the owner of this company wanted to make sure everybody felt safe disclosing any mistakes or errors they might have made. Whoops, I erased the whole database. So these are things that you don't want people on your team hiding. Now, there are the places that are known to the self and are known to others. This is the area of free activity. This is something you can actually work with. And so part of the goal in the Johari window is to move everything from the blind area, the avoided or hidden area, and also as much as possible from the area of unknown activity into this area of free activity. And there are some dynamics that help us to do this. And to move things from the blind area to the area of free activity, we learn how to give and receive feedback, and we create a culture of feedback. So there are teachable and learnable skills for giving really useful feedback. And there are learnable skills for how to receive feedback in the best way possible, regardless of how it's delivered. And teaching people skills for giving and receiving feedback is different than creating a culture of feedback. My favorite definition of culture comes from Seth Godin, where he defines culture as people like us do things like this. And so when you have a culture that says, in this organization, this is what we do. We give each other feedback with the intention of improving, with the intention of up-leveling, not to judge you, not to cut you down, but because we see that we can improve and we can do better. So in order to move things from the blind area to the area of free activity, we engage feedback. And to move things from the avoided or hidden area into this area of free activity, disclosure is what we want to engage. And so how do we create the psychological safety in the group, in the organization, for people to feel safe to disclose, hey, this is what's happening? One of the things that I do in the meetings that I run in my organization is we usually do some form of check-in or temperature check just to see, how is everybody doing? It gives us emotional context, and it lets me know whether there's anything that I need to be aware of. If I'm running a meeting and somebody's parent died that morning, I would want to know. If somebody's really struggling or if somebody's having a great day, these are things that could be valuable to know for any facilitator or anybody in a position of structural power. So this is the short version of the Johari window. Let's turn now to nonviolent communication. There's a lot of material that we're not going to cover. We're just going to look at some basic principles. And to be clear, nonviolent communication is not for violent people. It was called nonviolent communication by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg because he wanted to align himself with Gandhi's movement, which was actually about truth-telling and compassion. So we'll look at 4 options for how to interpret any message. We'll look at a useful tool called the tube of communication. And we'll look at this very, very valuable principle of connection before solution. So, what are the 4 options for how to interpret any message? We'll start first with 2 modes of consciousness. For the sake of time and for this presentation, we're just going to call them the judgmental consciousness and the empowered and compassionate consciousness. If we were to drill a little deeper, the judgmental consciousness is a consciousness that uses blame and criticism and avoids responsibility and expresses itself by placing demands on others, and it tries to manipulate people, coerce them into doing what this person wants without really caring about the other's needs. The empowered, compassionate communication is self-connected and knows what it wants and wants to meet its needs in a way that's in harmony with the needs of others. And if you want collaboration and teamwork, really take note of some of the gold nuggets that are here for you. So we start with these 2 modes of consciousness, and from each one, we're going to look at, for example, the judgmental attention directed outwardly, in other words, judging the other people, and judgmental attention directed inwardly, judging myself. And from the empowered compassionate communication, again, attention directed inward, also known as self-connection and self-empathy. That empowered compassionate communication directed outwardly, also known as empathy or empathic sensing. So, for example, if somebody says, "Hey, Rafa, you were a jerk," in the first instance, from the judgmental attention directed outwardly, I'll judge them back. "Hey, you have no right to call me that. I'm not a jerk. You're a jerk." Option number 2, if they call me a jerk, I take their judgment and I internalize it, and now I feel terrible about myself. So in option 2, I'm guaranteed to experience some form of shame or guilt or depression. In option 1, I'm guaranteed to experience some kind of anger or rage. Let's look at the other 2 options, option 3 and 4. Somebody calls me a jerk, and in option 3, I get to become curious about what's happening inside me when somebody calls me this thing. Now, it could be anything. I'm just using this one example. But often we receive communication that is not to our pleasing. And just remember, we have these 4 options. And part of the usefulness of this is that I'm learning how to interpret things in a way that I can stay regulated and I'm more able to interact with it in a constructive way. So somebody calls me a jerk, and in option 3, I take this empowered and compassionate attention, turn it inward, and I'm curious, what's alive in me when I hear these words? And so perhaps I feel some disappointment, maybe sadness, because I really value belonging and acceptance. Notice how that's different than judging the other person or judging myself. I'm simply connected with the life in me, and I realize, I have a need for belonging and acceptance, and actually everybody does. And so I feel some sadness or some disappointment, and then now I can work constructively with it. Or perhaps what's coming up for me is that I feel irritation because I have a need for understanding. I want to be seen differently. I don't see myself as a jerk, And so I feel irritated because I have a need for understanding. Again, that's different than judging the other person or judging myself. The fourth option is now I have the chance, the opportunity to become curious about what's going on for the other person when they call me a jerk. Perhaps we were walking in the door, I didn't notice them behind me with their hands full, and I let the door shut behind me, and they were not able to open the door because their hands were full. And so then they're like, "You jerk." So perhaps in that instance, they were needing consideration and support. So they feel upset because they had a need for consideration and support. This is different than hearing their judgment, "You jerk." Instead, I can turn my attention to, what was it that they were actually needing, or what were their values underneath this judgment or blame or criticism or a verbal attack. Now, these are skills that I teach people. I learned them from Dr. Marshall Rosenberg. I've been a certified trainer in nonviolent communication for over 20 years. And you can actually learn how to listen to what's deeper than the blame, judgment, criticism, or verbal attack, to hear the needs and values of the other person so that you're getting less defensive, you're able to stand in a more compassionate place, and you're able to diffuse any potential conflict before it happens. Now, of these four options, I could actually keep them to myself in silence, or I could speak them out loud. And so this gives me 8 possibilities. And just to be clear, each of these slides that I'm showing you, we can unpack into not just presentations, but also exercises that people can do to increase their skills, and actual live practice so that participants experience the edge of where their skills are. Let's turn to this lovely, simple, but not always easy concept of the tube of communication. I want to tell you a story first. And this story involves my teacher in NVC, Marshall Rosenberg. Years and years ago, he was invited to teach nonviolent communication at a refugee camp in Palestine. And he's entering the mosque where he's going to give the presentation. And inside the mosque are 170 Palestinian men. And as he's getting up on the stage, his interpreter turns to him and says, "Hey, they're murmuring that you're an American." And at that point, a man in the audience stands up, points his finger at Marshall, and says, "You murderer!" And somebody else yells, "Child killer!" Somebody else, "Assassin!" "Butcher!" And the whole room starts to get riled up. So then Marshall and his interpreter turn to the crowd and they say, "Whoa, hold on. And they try to, help people relax. And then Marshall turns to the man, the first man who called him a murderer, and he says, "Sir, are you upset because you would like my government to spend its resources in a different way?" And the guy says, "Hell yeah. We don't need bombs. We don't need armored bulldozers. We don't need tear gas. We need schools. We need housing. We need health clinics." So then Marshall stays with him and says, "It sounds like you have very strong feelings for the world to know the kind of conditions that you're living under." The guy says, "Yeah. You ever seen schools without books? You ever seen children playing in the open sewers?" And so Marshall, staying with him, says, "Well, it sounds like you would like for your children what any parent would want for their own children." And the guy's like, "Yeah." Now this went on for about 40 minutes, with Marshall demonstrating a different quality of listening, and this guy basically venting his pain. And after about 40 minutes, the guy stopped talking, because that's one of the 2 things that happens when somebody gets enough empathy. The other thing that happens is that there's a shift. It's like a little ka-chunk feeling in your body. In fact, a whole room full of people can feel it. It's almost like the barometric pressure shifts a little bit. And so the guy was vented out. He had nothing more to say. And there was this little shift in the energy. And so then Marshall came back with his honesty, and he said, "Well, sir, I feel rather frustrated because I was invited to give a presentation here. So I'm wondering if you could grant me the remainder of our time for me to continue." And the guy said, Yeah, go ahead. And so Marshall continued with his presentation. At the end of his presentation, the very same guy who called him a murderer came up to Marshall and invited him to have Ramadan dinner with his family. Now, consider the other possibilities of how Dr. Rosenberg, who I'm calling Marshall, because that's what I called him in person, how he could have responded. One of those options could have been to get defensive. As soon as the guy called him a murderer, say, "You have no right to call me that. You haven't seen the books I've written. You haven't seen the mediations that I do around the world." That probably would not have gone very well. The other option is he could have decided, boy, I am not safe here. What am I doing here? An American with the last name Rosenberg. This is not safe, and tucked his tail between his legs and run. That could have been another option. But instead, he realized that this man calling him a murderer was somebody who was in pain. His needs were not met. And this is why this was happening. Any judgment is a tragic expression of unmet needs. And Marshall claims that at that point in his career, he had gotten to the point where no matter what anybody said, he only heard one of two things: please and thank you. So looking at the story, let me explain the tube of communication. So imagine that you and I are in a conversation, but we have this tube, like a simple poster tube or a clear plastic tube, and you want to get your point across, so you start putting your scarf through the tube. But I also want to get my point across at the same time, and so I start putting my scarf through the tube. Well, what happens is the tube gets clogged, and neither one of us gets heard. And so one of the insights is that I can take my scarf, pull it out of the tube, and put it on the shelf momentarily. I'm not denying my truth. I'm not giving in to you. And I'm not suppressing or repressing anything. I'm just simply taking my scarf and putting it on the shelf temporarily to allow your scarves to come through. And as they come through, I can check them out with you. Green one? Yeah, green one. Okay, next one. Oh, red one? Oh, okay, red one. And this is what Marshall Rosenberg demonstrated in the first part of this conversation, this story that I just told you. 40 minutes worth of scarves coming through. Hey, have you ever seen schools without books? You ever seen children playing in the open sewers? And Marshall receiving the message and then saying, oh, sounds like you only want for your children what anybody would want for their own children. Yeah! And like that, it just kept going. And once all the scarves were through, now the tube was clear. And then Marshall took his truth off the shelf and sent it through the tube, because now it was clear. And he said, hey, I feel frustrated. I'd like to continue with my presentation. Are you willing? So this tool, the tube of communication, teaches us something that most of us learned in kindergarten. It's called taking turns, which is simple, but it's extremely difficult when emotions are hitting the frying pan and when both of us really want to get heard. So one of the insights, one of the principles here is the other person is more likely to hear you out if they feel heard first. And one of the things that the executives and the leaders that I work with understand is that even if my response is the correct one, even if I have the right thing to say, when I allow the other person on my team or in my organization or the external customer, when I allow them to also get heard, which is different than agreeing, but when I allow their message to come through the tube, then they feel heard. They can relax. Now they're more open to hearing me out, and we're much more likely to arrive at a situation where there's buy-in and where it's more possible for us to actually have real collaboration. So that's the tube of communication. Now let's look at this important principle, which is the most overlooked insight for preventing and resolving conflicts, and the principle is titled Connection Before Solution. Now, this whole presentation, even though it has insights for everyday life and personal relationships, it's a training for people in the workplace. And one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that people don't come to work to be emotionally close with other people at work. So what we're looking for is enough connection so that we can work well together and we can get the work done that we came together to do in a way that's harmonious, in a way that there's teamwork, and in a way that when we're done, we can high-five each other instead of walking away in disgust because we really don't like the other people on the team. I was once hired by the owner of a company to train everybody in his company. And when I got down to the big why of why he wanted me to do this training, he said, I want to enjoy going to work and I want to enjoy it when I leave work because the interpersonal environment had become so toxic. And so this is one of the things that you can do to make the environment in your organization, the interpersonal environment, much more enjoyable, constructive, harmonious. We need enough connection. And people with a high quality of connection more readily prevent and resolve misunderstandings and conflicts. So, connection before solution, what does this mean? Well, here we have one heart, how I am and what I would like. And we also have how you are and what you would like. And there's some kind of relationship. Now, let's say that there's a disconnect. The habitual tendency when there's a disconnection is to jump to some kind of strategy or solution. It happens at work all the time. Okay, fine, I'll take on this other project. Or it happens at home. Oh, don't worry, honey, daddy will buy you a new one. We jump to fix it. It happens in intimate relationships. It happens in every context. Now, when we skip the connection and we jump to a solution, these strategies tend to be less effective or durable. And I'll give you a quick example. I had a student who was the head of an IT department of about 200 people, and somebody above him imposed a procedural change that affected all 200 people in the IT department, but this person never checked to see if there were any concerns and never got buy-in from the department. So what happened? There was foot dragging, subtle sabotage, resentment, employee turnover. It ended up being quite expensive. And so one name for this pattern is go fast to go slow. Why? Because the other person went fast, they skipped the connection. They jumped to a solution and now everything had to go slow because, again, subtle sabotage, foot dragging, or more conflicts. So instead of go fast to go slow, I recommend go slow to go fast. And what does this mean? What does this look like? Well, we go slow in the sense that we take time to create mutual understanding. We work on the connection. Now, if we already have KLT, if we've worked on some of the other elements that I've talked about in this presentation, this happens more easily and more readily. If people in your organization have lost trust with each other, there are ways to remedy that. I've got lots of case studies and examples of my own. But when we have this at least mutual understanding level of connection, that connection naturally leads to a shared exploration of the strategies and the solutions. So now that the problem-solving process has become collaborative, these strategies tend to be more effective and durable. So instead of go fast to go slow, I recommend go slow to go fast. The early investment saves everybody a lot of time and a lot of grief. So again, this principle is called connection before solution. Okay, let's end with this last concept, and this one takes a little bit more to unpack. So if you want to pause the presentation now and go get a glass of water or a cup of coffee or take a bio break, this is one of the more useful and powerful conceptual tools for disambiguating some very, very confusing elements in leadership and power. So the 4 quadrants come from Ken Wilber's integral framework. And just to give a little bit of background, Ken Wilber's integral framework is a meta theory. That means it's a theory of theories. Ken Wilber is called by many of his students the Einstein of consciousness. And that's because even today, more than 100 years later, we're still digesting and integrating Einstein's theory of general relativity. And in a similar way, Ken Wilber's work is transforming many fields simultaneously, the impact of which will be known more profoundly many years from now. Ken Wilber's Integral Framework is one of the workshops I teach. I give people a guided tour through his framework. And in that workshop, in those trainings, I teach 6 elements: holons, quadrants, lines, levels, states, and types. And right now we're just going to look at one of those 6, and that's the 4 quadrants. So the 4 quadrants, this concept tells us that each and every phenomenon in the universe has 4 intrinsic dimensions, none of which can be reduced to any of the others. These 4 intrinsic dimensions are the 4 quadrants. Likewise, each and every phenomenon can be perceived through each of these 4 aspects or dimensions. In other words, the 4 quadrants give you a place to stand or a perspective from which to see any particular phenomenon. And many people in many fields end up being reductionists. They try to reduce everything to the quadrant that is their area of expertise. But let's just remember, we can't reduce any of the quadrants to any of the others. All 4 quadrants appear and evolve together. So let's look at the 4 quadrants. Every phenomenon has interior dimensions and exterior dimensions. And every phenomenon has individual manifestations and collective manifestations. So this gives us the upper left as the individual interior, upper right is the individual exterior, and then we have the collective interior is the lower left and the collective exterior is the lower right. These can be referred to as I, we is the collective interior, it, the individual exterior, and its would be the plural of it in the lower right quadrant. Just to get a little more granular on the definition, and I'm going to give you lots of examples here to make this make sense and how it applies to life and business. In the upper left quadrant, the individual interior is, for example, where your intentions live. And to be clear, let me explain one piece. The right-hand quadrants are things that can be weighed and measured. In other words, traditional, conventional, empirical science can only tell us about the right-hand quadrants because, again, these are things that can be weighed and measured. The left-hand quadrants have depth and need to be interpreted in some way. So in the upper left quadrant are my intentions, my individual experience, and so this would be the intrapersonal quadrant or subjective. Now the upper right quadrant would be physiological. I can hold my arm in a certain way and we can measure that angle and we can say, oh, the angle of my elbow is 89 degrees. So observable behaviors, things a video camera might pick up. And so this would be objective. The lower left quadrant is interpersonal, intersubjective, and cultural. So this is where things like shared values and shared horizons of meaning, and when we say we understand each other, that would be in this lower left quadrant of the collective interior. So this is known as cultural, as opposed to social, which is the lower right. In the lower right quadrant, the collective exterior, we're looking at systems and structures. It's known as interobjective. So there is an exterior objective world we all share. You could come over to my house, we could open the front door and stick our heads out and we can both agree it's either raining or it's not raining. Again, the lower right quadrant is known as social versus the lower left, which is cultural. So let's look at a few fields just to get a better sense of how this works and what it is. So if we look at the field of medicine, for example, we'll pick a phenomenon, let's say depression. So let's say I experience depression, and that would be in my upper left, in the upper left quadrant here. And to be clear, the map is not the territory, right? All charts lie, but some are useful. So this is just a way of looking at the reality, but again, the map is not the territory. So let's say that I experience depression, so we'd be talking about the upper left quadrant. If I go to a medical practitioner who tends to reduce everything to the upper right quadrant, they're going to say the reason that you're depressed is because you need certain neurotransmitters in your synapses, and so you need more dopamine, or you need more serotonin or oxytocin, and so here, take this pill. So that's if I go to a allopathic practitioner who reduces everything to the upper right quadrant, where allopathic medicine might see the human body as just a very, very fancy machine. And so they're looking at the mechanics, and so they say, oh, you need neurotransmitters, take this pill. Now, if I go to someone who reduces everything to the upper left quadrant, they might say, hey, the reason that you're depressed is because you need more meaning and purpose in your life. Now, that might be true too. So, and it could be that both these things are true at the same time. Now, if we look at the lower left quadrant, if I experience depression, but I live in a culture where it's not okay to talk about depression. In other words, there's shame added to the experience of depression, and there's not even any support groups for people suffering from depression. If that's my experience, that I live in this kind of culture where on top of the depression there's shame and I can't talk about it, I'm going to have a different experience of that depression in that upper left quadrant. In the lower right quadrant, if I live in a society where there is the infrastructure for me to go to the support group or for me to access the medication, that's going to be a very different internal experience of my depression than if I live in a society where there is not even the infrastructure to access the medication or the support group or whatever it is that I actually need. So all four quadrants arise together, they influence each other, and they evolve together. So that's just one example from integral medicine. Again, an integral approach looks at all four quadrants and also the other elements that I mentioned of the integral framework, but we're just sticking to quadrants right now in order to get better results and better solutions. Looking briefly at integral politics, your typical liberal perspective tends to preference interior causality, and your typical conservative perspective tends to preference exterior causality. So if we take a phenomenon such as, let's say, homelessness, your typical conservative will say, oh, well, the reason that this person is homeless is because they lack skills or they lack motivation or they have mental health issues. And your typical liberal will say, well, the reason this person is homeless is because we live in a society that has systems and structures in which the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and polarization of wealth is built into how the system works, and it creates more poverty. So we live in systems and structures that create homelessness. So every situation of homelessness is unique, and there's a difference between situational poverty and generational poverty, and there's a difference between situational trauma and generational trauma. So I'm not trying to reduce a very complex phenomenon, but for the purpose of this presentation, we're just simplifying and pointing out that, in any given situation, both might be true. There might be interior causes and exterior causes. So when we're looking at the political arena in general, we're probably going to get better answers and better results if we can integrate the best of liberal views and conservative views and come up with even better solutions. So rather than playing the game, who's right and who's wrong, we can actually look at what works and integrate the best perspectives from these different approaches. Let's look briefly at integral business. It turns out that there are 4 theories, generally speaking, there are 4 theories of business management. And there are white papers published and conferences in which people debate which one of these theories is more correct and is better than the others. And it just happens to turn out that these 4 theories of business management map out onto the 4 quadrants. So in the upper left quadrant, we have the theory of business management that says if we give people better skills, if we give them leadership development trainings, if we help them with professional development, then that's how we're going to get the best results and the best work out of people. In the upper right quadrant, the individual exterior, this is where like timesheets and stopwatches and things come in, and like how many people per hour did the cashier, process, things like that. And this is where we're looking at measurable, observable behaviors. In the lower left quadrant, this theory of business management would say the way that we get the best work out of people is we create the best culture. We create a culture where there's psychological safety, where people feel safe coming to work. And where people can bring their whole selves. And so we create this really great culture, and we create a culture of feedback and a culture where people are able to take, let's say, maternity and paternity leave and that kind of thing. So we create the best culture. That would be the theory of business management in the lower left quadrant. And in the lower right quadrant, this theory would say the way we get the best work out of people and the way that we create the best outputs and results is we give people the best campus. So there's corporate campuses that have basketball courts, or people can ride bicycles or roller skate to their office, or there's a break room that has ping pong tables and foosball tables. And so we create the most wonderful working environment. We create this campus. And so some rooms might have the setup to promote collaboration, and other places might have a setup to promote focus and concentration, and an open floor plan, and all these things that people are creating when they create these beautiful corporate campuses. Well, you can probably see by now that the best results are going to come if we draw from all four quadrants. All four of them are correct. They're just looking at very different elements and different pieces. So an integral approach to business management would draw from the best results, from the best ideas from each of these four quadrants. Next, let's look at integral communication. So in the upper left quadrant, I've got my individual experience, my feelings, my needs, my values, my desires, my wants. In the upper right quadrant, there are observable behaviors, and there are ways that we act that are objectively observed. And then in the lower left quadrant, in the we space, there's mutual understanding, and there's preventing and resolving conflicts, and there's getting on the same page about things. And in the lower right quadrant, there are systems, structures. One example of the area of systems and how it affects communication is there's a principle that I share with my clients quite a bit, especially couples, that says that the faster the medium, the less conducive it is to connection. So, for example, texting. If we need to process feelings and needs and emotions, please don't do it over text, because that is the most likely place to have a miscommunication, because you don't hear tone of voice, you don't see body language, it's much too fast. So texting could be very useful for, yes, I'll meet you at the restaurant at 3, or hey, how close are you? Or I'm 10 minutes away. But if we need to process emotions, go with something slower. Email is really too fast most of the time. It can be done via email, but a phone call or an in-person meeting. And we remember to slow things down so that we can be attuned and connected. And so systems very much impact communication. Another example that comes to mind was when I tried to do a workshop for some people in a country where people had to ride a bus between 40 minutes and 2 hours to get to the place that had Wi-Fi. And then there were like 20 people crowded around a little laptop, and the reception kept going in and out. It kept, we kept losing the Wi-Fi, and it was very, very frustrating. So this is just another element of communication. Okay, the next two slides are power and leadership. So let's look at these. So integral power. We have 4 different types of power. And I was in the room with one of my colleagues, an NVC trainer, and a man who happened to be African American, grew up in a rural area, and had recently come out of prison. He had spent about 20 years in prison. And the NVC trainer says to him, "Nobody can oppress you unless you let them." And the other guy who had just gotten out of prison said, "Excuse me?" And the two of them could not see eye to eye. They were really just in an argument. And I slowed them down and I said, hold on a second. Let me just, and I grabbed the flip chart and I drew these 4 quadrants. And I was able to describe how they were each talking about a different quadrant. So they were using the same word for something quite different. So in the upper left quadrant, when we're talking about power, we're talking about interior power. This is also known as spiritual power. So if you've ever heard of Peace Pilgrim, or a more well-known example would be Nelson Mandela. So this is the kind of power that enabled him to survive 27 years in prison, befriend his jailers, and come out fairly intact, enough so that he became the next president of his country. So interior power, personal power, also known as spiritual power. That's in the upper left quadrant. In the upper right quadrant, there's physical power. So maybe a very tall person helps me get something off of a shelf, or I see somebody being physically abused or bullied and I use my physical power to protect them, or somebody with more strength opens a jar for somebody else. So that would be physical power. Now in the lower left, there's relational or interpersonal power. And examples of this would be like the person who can call in a lot of favors. As soon as they need something, 100 people are present and show up because this person can call in all those favors. Or, and perhaps you've seen this, there's someone in very many organizations have someone who's very soft-spoken and not flashy or showy, but as soon as this person starts to speak, everybody quiets down and perks up their ears to hear what this person has to say, because they garner so much respect from the people around them. So that's an example of relational or interpersonal power. And lastly, we have structural or systemic power. So structural power would be, like in any given organization, there's somebody who has the power to decide what time we're going to have the meeting, and there's somebody else entirely who has the power to decide whether or not that person gets fired. So the different roles that we have in an organizational hierarchy are examples of this structural power. Now let's say the organization and this organizational hierarchy all disappear, and these two people run into each other at the grocery store. That structural power is gone. So this is specifically the power that is given to us by the roles that we play in any given structure. So these are the 4 quadrants when we're looking at power. And next, let's look at leadership. An integral leader is someone who is self-connected. They know what they're feeling, what they're needing. Most of the time they can tell if they're making an interpretation or if they're making assumptions. They have this inner clarity. They know what they want, they know where they're going, and they're connected to their own personal power. An integral leader is someone who can be said through their observable behaviors is someone who acts with courage. They're willing to speak truth to power, or someone who's said to act with integrity, or they lead by example. In the lower left quadrant, an integral leader knows how to create mutual understanding between themselves and others, or help other people. They can facilitate mutual understanding between other people on their team. And they also know how to cultivate positive relationships and develop more of that interpersonal and relational power, but also more harmony and more collaborative feeling in any kind of team or workplace. And this person can facilitate mutually satisfying outcomes. And in the lower right quadrant, we have the ability to navigate systems effectively. This is a whole set of skills unto itself. One of my greatest teachers in this was my mother. She knew how to wrangle a bureaucracy like nobody else. And if the current systems and structures that we have are not serving us, how to create new systems and structures. And this usually also involves interpersonal power, because we need to get other people on board if we're going to collaborate to create new systems and structures. But it takes a bit to understand what's needed when we're creating new systems and structures. So these are 4 quadrants of leadership. So again, I have been Alan Rafael Seid, also known as Rafa Kalapa, and you can find me at rafakalapa.com. And if you want to check out Kalapa, Wisdom School for Changemakers, you can go to thekalapa.com. Thank you.